everybody, and welcome to another video. Today we're actually going to be talking about how learning works and how you can actually get better at it. We're first going to begin by talking about the neurobiology of what is happening in your brain when you're learning new information or when you're trying to remember that information that you did learn before. And this is because I think it's very important to learn the basics of what's going on before you can really learn how to improve. And then I will get into 5 different tips and tricks that can help you become a better learner. I do ask that if you enjoy this video, if you could please give it a thumbs up or comment below, share the video, or subscribe to my channel. That would really help me out in my journey, and I thank you in advance. I think without further ado, we can get started and we can get learning about learning. So let's get right into the neurobiology of learning. At the very basics, there are 86 billion neurons in our brains that are carrying electrical signals. And so a signal travels from one neuron down its axon to make contact with another neuron. And that is how we communicate with ourselves and with the environment around us. That connection between the two neurons is something called a synapse. At the synapse, there is the release of various neurotransmitters and other chemicals that act as chemical messengers to tell the next cell what to do. And this is how our brain cells or our neurons communicate with each other. And this electrical signal is what we call an action potential. And they are occurring all the time. For me to be able to communicate this information to you takes many neurons, and everything from my thinking, breathing, heart beating is all due to my brain sending those action potentials and communicating with other neurons. And so this one action potential will actually lead to a cascade of events, which often results in more action potentials being fired, but is also the reason why we can think, act, feel, and really be. And one thing that's really important to note here, especially when it comes to learning, is every time neuron A, we will call it, interacts with neuron B, that connection strengthens. At that synapse between neuron A and B, we end up seeing more receptors. And so what that means is that neuron B becomes a lot more sensitive to the signals of neuron A. And so the next time A tries to send a signal to B, it'll be much easier to do so. This represents something called long-term potentiation. And it's why it's easier to relearn something than learning it for the first time. And this is because we already have the neural circuitry in place for that specific connection. This also goes into why people say that practice makes perfect. And that's because every time we do a task over again, we end up just strengthening that connection between neuron A and B. So the more you practice or repeat something, the stronger that neural connection will be, the more receptors there will be in the synapse, and the more sensitive neuron B will be to the signals of neuron A. And so what this means for us is we will be able to retrieve that information a lot faster and more accurately. The more we practice a skill or the more we study material. And this is actually a perfect segue into the next section of our video, which is focused on how you can become a better learner. And so my first tip for you today is to practice. And this goes into another common saying, which is use it or lose it. And this comes down to something called synaptic pruning. What this means is our brain actually is able to get rid of information that we have no use for anymore. And so this is really interesting when you look at developmental psychology or even just developmental biology, in that when you are an infant, you actually have way more neurons than you have as an adult. And the brain then goes in and gets rid of all of the neurons, all of the connections that are not useful for you. So this is why you can't master a language perfectly usually after the age of 5, because before 5, our brains are capable of making all of the sounds that are necessary to learn all of the languages in the world. But all of that information is actually not needed if you only go on to speak 1 or 2 languages. And so they get rid of those connections, get rid of those neurons in order to make room for new information. The second tip for learning is actually to learn using multiple senses. And with that, it really comes down to the more, the better. Our brain actually has 4 different lobes, each with a different primary function. When it comes to studying or to learning new information, we really want to be focused on the occipital lobe, which is at the back of the brain, the temporal lobe, which is kind of at the side here, and the frontal lobe, which is obviously the front of your brain area. And that is because when we are reading information, we are using the occipital lobe, which is mostly visual information. When we are listening to a lecturer or what you're doing right now, you are actually using your temporal lobe. And when you are making notes, using concept maps, or studying the material, you are using your frontal lobe. I mention this because the more interconnection you have of your senses and of the material that you are covering, the easier it is to remember that information. And this is because the same cue has multiple different ways that it can trigger your remembering. With multiple storage areas, there's an increased opportunity for retrieving that information, which is what you want on a test. So for example, the best study tactics would include listening to your lecturer tell you the information for the first time, making notes during that process, and then making additional notes, either more summarized, more organized, or something like a concept map, which allows you to visualize how all the information actually connects to one another. If you wanted to then take that concept map or that information and retell it to someone else, that's also going to really boost the probability that you will remember or really understand that information. And this leads me to my third point, which is that if you really want to understand information, you need to teach it to someone else. And this goes into something called the protégé effect. When you are preparing to teach a concept, you end up organizing the information into a logical way to explain something to somebody else. This makes you look at the process as a whole and understand each individual component of that process and organize it in a way that you can present it all very neatly, concretely, and effectively. It also makes you go out and seek the most important information. You often want to give a very short and concise explanation of very complicated issues, which makes you look for those key information or key target areas. This act in it of itself is actually a very good study tool that is often neglected in regular study habits, but it's one that can really solidify the information in your mind. So go and teach somebody else. The fourth tip that I'm going to be giving you today is to actually connect this new information with things that you already know. And this is connected to something called relational learning. And another common saying you might have heard is that what wires together fires together. And this really comes into play during this tip. The things that you already know have very strong neural connections in your brain, but the new things don't. They don't have that neural circuitry formed already. So what you can do is you can actually merge that new information with something you already have a very strong neural connection for. And that can make retrieving that new information way easier. So this can be something like if you were learning the process of glycolysis or oxidation or any sort of complex system, if you come up with a metaphor of something that you already have experience with, that is really going to help you learn this complicated and novel process and help you access that information on test day. My fifth tip is a very important one, and that is to take breaks. Our brains can very easily get overloaded with information, and this often happens when we're learning new information or when we're studying things that we have learned in the past. This stress can actually prevent further learning. As soon as you get anxious or overwhelmed, it's really important to take a study break. And this can really mean just 10 minutes of walking around your house, maybe getting a snack, maybe doing some jumping jacks on the spot. Just a short mental break can really help you moving forward. I recommend a 10-minute break for every 1 hour to an hour and a half of intense learning or studying. And when you think about it, university classes are usually formulated in this way. You have an hour to an hour and a half lecture and then a 10-minute to 15-minute break to walk to your next class. And this is actually on purpose. And this is so that your brain can have a short break and to relieve that brain fatigue that does naturally happen when we are trying to do something for too long. So just take a 10-minute break for every hour of studying and you will see better results. So that wraps up my How Learning Works and How to Learn Better video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that coming out of this video you learned something, but you definitely can take this information and learn how to learn better, because that is the purpose and that is what we all strive to do as students and also as humans with curious minds. And let me know in the comments below if any of them work for you, if you have any tweaks, or if you have any additional tips that I did not cover in this video. Thanks for sticking around for the duration of this video, and I hope to see you around soon.